I didn't move when he stood between me and the door. The moment should have made me uncomfortable, maybe even scared. The hallway behind him was dim, the soft yellow light from the kitchen stretching across the wooden floor and stopping right at his shoes. The front door was just a step behind him, my exit. But he didn't touch me. He didn't even raise his voice. He just stood there. His hand rested lightly against the doorframe beside my shoulder, not trapping me, just close enough that I could feel the quiet certainty in the gesture, like he already knew I wasn't going anywhere. And the strange part? He was right. My fingers were still wrapped around my car keys. I could hear them trembling softly against each other every time my hand moved, a tiny metallic sound in the silence between us. I looked at the door, then at him, and for a second neither of us spoke. The air in the apartment felt warmer than it had a minute ago. The window behind me was slightly open, and the curtains moved with the night breeze, brushing against the wall with a soft whisper. "You're leaving," he finally said. Not a question. His voice was calm, low, the kind of voice that doesn't rush because it already knows the answer. I swallowed and shifted my weight from one foot to the other. The wooden floor creaked under my heel. "I should," I replied quietly. He tilted his head just a little, studying my face like there was something written there he was trying to understand. But he didn't move. The light above the kitchen island flickered faintly, and I suddenly became painfully aware of everything. The distance between us, the warmth of his body so close to mine, the faint scent of his cologne still lingering in the air from when he'd passed me earlier in the hallway. God, I shouldn't even have been here. His wife, my friend, had only stepped out 20 minutes ago to pick up something from the store. She'd laughed while grabbing her purse, telling us she'd be back before the wine even had time to breathe. And yet here we were, standing in a quiet apartment that suddenly felt far too small. "You could leave," he said softly, but the way he said it made my breath catch, because his body didn't shift even an inch away from the door. The keys in my hand jingled again when my fingers tightened. "I know," I whispered. He watched me carefully then, not pushing, not pleading, just waiting. His eyes dropped briefly to my mouth before returning to mine, and that tiny movement made something dangerous twist low in my chest. "You're not moving," he said. I felt the words in my stomach before I answered. Neither of us looked away. "No," I admitted. The silence that followed was heavy, not awkward, just full. My heartbeat started to thud harder against my ribs, loud enough that I wondered if he could hear it from where he stood. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, headlights briefly spilling through the window before fading away again. Still, he didn't step aside. And the truth I didn't want to admit was already sitting quietly between us. I wasn't trapped. Not really. If I wanted to leave, I could have taken one small step forward and asked him to move. He would have. I'm almost certain of that. But instead, I stayed exactly where I was. And when his hand slid just slightly higher along the doorframe beside my head, my breath caught before I could stop it. His eyes darkened when he heard it. "Tell me to move," he said quietly. The words hung in the air between us. My fingers slowly loosened around the keys. And for reasons I still don't fully understand, I didn't say a word. The silence between us stretched long enough that I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. It was such an ordinary sound, so normal, which made the moment feel even more unreal. My hand slowly lowered from the door handle. The keys slipped against my palm again, a quiet metallic chime that echoed through the hallway. He noticed. Of course he did. His eyes dropped briefly to my hand before lifting back to my face. Something in his expression changed then. Not triumph, not surprise. Just a quiet recognition. Like a door had opened somewhere neither of us had meant to unlock. "You're still here," he said softly. The words weren't accusing. If anything, they sounded almost careful. I exhaled slowly, the breath leaving me warmer than it should have. "You're still blocking the door," I replied. For the first time, the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. Not a smile exactly, just the faintest shift. "You could ask me to move." I could. The sentence hung in my chest like something fragile. My eyes drifted past him to the door again. Just a few inches of space between his shoulder and the wall. Enough to slip through if I really wanted to. But I didn't step forward. Instead, my gaze returned to him. Up close like this, I noticed things I had never allowed myself to see before. The faint shadow along his jaw from a day without shaving. The way his shirt sleeves were rolled just enough to reveal the strong line of his forearms. Details that suddenly felt dangerous. I should go, I murmured again. But the words came out weaker this time. He studied me quietly, his fingers shifting slightly against the doorframe. Not closer. Just moving like he was grounding himself. You've said that twice, he replied. Another beat of silence passed. My heartbeat was starting to feel ridiculous now, loud, restless, impossible to ignore. I folded my arms loosely across my stomach, trying to steady the nervous energy running through me. You're my wife's friend, he said after a moment. The sentence landed heavily in the hallway. Guilt flashed through me instantly. Yes, I said. Neither of us moved. The curtain in the living room rustled again as a soft night breeze slipped through the window. Somewhere outside, a dog barked once in the distance. Everything in the world kept moving. But in that narrow hallway, time felt like it had slowed. His voice dropped slightly when he spoke again. And yet, he said quietly, you're still not leaving. I let out a small shaky breath. You're still watching me, I countered. That made his eyes flicker. Not away, just deeper. The space between us suddenly felt smaller than before. I became aware of the warmth radiating from him, the subtle rise and fall of his chest as he breathed. Close enough that if either of us leaned forward even slightly, I pushed the thought away. You should move, I said softly, but my feet stayed rooted to the floor. He didn't respond right away. Instead, his gaze searched my face slowly, like he was trying to read the truth behind the words. And then he asked something that made my stomach tighten instantly. Do you actually want me to? The question landed gently, but it echoed through every nerve in my body. My lips parted. No answer came out, because the truth was sitting right there between us now, unspoken but impossible to ignore. I could walk out that door. He would let me. But something in the way he stood there, calm, patient, completely still, made it clear he understood something I was only just beginning to admit to myself. I wasn't staying because I had no choice. I was staying because part of me wanted to see what would happen if I did. His hand shifted again against the wall beside my head. Closer this time. Not touching. Just close enough that I felt the warmth of it. My breath caught before I could stop it. And when he heard it, his voice dropped to almost a whisper. You're shaking. You're shaking. His voice was quiet, but it landed directly in my chest. I hadn't realized how obvious it was until he said it. My fingers were still loosely holding the keys, and the tiny tremor in my hand made them click softly together. I tried to steady them. It didn't work. I'm not, I said automatically. The denial came too quickly. His eyes flicked down again, watching the faint movement of my hand before returning to my face. He didn't argue. He didn't call me out. But something in his gaze said he saw right through it. The hallway light cast a warm glow across his shoulders, and I suddenly became aware of how close he really was. Not touching me, but close enough that the heat of his body reached me in slow waves. You always do that, he said after a moment. My brow furrowed slightly. Do what? Avoid the obvious. The comment caught me off guard. I shifted my weight again, my back brushing lightly against the wall beside the door. The paint felt cool through the thin fabric of my dress, a sharp contrast to the warmth building in the small space between us. You don't know me that well, I replied. His expression changed slightly at that. Don't I? The question lingered. And suddenly 100 small memories flashed through my mind. Dinners at their apartment. Weekend barbecues. Movie nights where we all sat on the same couch, laughing at the same scenes. Moments where our eyes had met across the room for just a second longer than they should have. Moments I had always forced myself to ignore. You're reading too much into things, I said softly. He didn't move. You came over tonight even though she told you she'd only be here for an hour before running errands. My heartbeat skipped. That's not strange, I replied quickly. No, he said. Another pause. Then more quietly. But staying after she left, that part is. My stomach tightened. I opened my mouth to answer, but the words didn't come. Because he wasn't wrong. I had told myself I stayed because the wine bottle was already open. Because we were in the middle of a conversation. because it would be awkward to grab my bag and leave immediately. Excuses that sounded reasonable in my head. But standing here now, with him between me and the door, none of them felt honest anymore. "You're thinking too much," I murmured. "Am I?" he asked gently. The air shifted when he moved then, just a small step closer to the doorframe. His arm lifted slightly, his palm now resting flat against the wall beside my head, still not touching me. But the space between us narrowed just enough that my breath caught again. I could smell the faint trace of soap on his skin now. Something clean, warm, familiar. My pulse started racing. "You could leave," he said again. The words were softer this time, but his eyes never left mine. I felt the door behind me when my shoulders brushed it lightly. Solid. Real. Escape. All I had to do was ask. My lips parted slowly, but instead of speaking, my gaze dropped, just for a second, to his mouth. It was such a small movement. But when my eyes lifted again, I saw that he had noticed. Of course he had. Something shifted in the room then, subtle but undeniable. The kind of change you can't take back once it happens. His voice lowered when he spoke again. "Tell me to move," he whispered. The same words as before. But this time they felt heavier. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I should have said it. I should have told him to step aside. Instead, my fingers slowly loosened, and the keys slipped from my hand. They hit the wooden floor with a sharp metallic clatter that echoed down the hallway. Neither of us looked down. Because suddenly, neither of us was pretending anymore. The keys hit the floor with a sharp metallic sound. For a moment, it felt like the entire apartment heard it. But neither of us looked down. My eyes stayed on his, and his stayed on mine. The air between us changed instantly. The small, polite distance we'd been pretending to maintain vanished with that single clatter against the wood floor. His gaze flickered briefly toward my empty hand, then back to my face. "You dropped them," he said quietly. I nodded, but my body didn't move to pick them up. "Yeah." Another silence followed, thicker this time. The kitchen light hummed faintly above us. Somewhere in the living room, the curtain brushed against the wall again as the night air slipped through the open window. Normal sounds. But everything in this hallway felt anything but normal. His hand was still pressed against the wall beside my head. Close enough that I could feel the warmth of it. Close enough that if I leaned even a little, my breath caught again. He noticed. His chest rose slowly with a quiet inhale. "You're making this very difficult," he said softly. My eyebrows pulled together slightly. "I'm making it difficult?" His head tilted, the faintest trace of disbelief touching his expression. "You're standing here," he said, his voice calm but deeper now, "looking at me like that." "I'm just standing here," I replied. But the words didn't even convince me. Because the truth was, I was very aware of the way my body had stopped trying to leave. My shoulder still rested lightly against the door behind me, like some quiet part of me had already decided it wasn't opening. His eyes searched my face slowly. "You could have picked up the keys." My gaze flickered downward for half a second, the small silver ring of them resting near his shoe. "I could still pick them up," I said. But neither of us moved. The space between us seemed to shrink with every breath. "You're my wife's friend," he repeated quietly. The reminder landed heavier this time. Guilt pressed against my ribs, but something else pressed there too. Something warmer. Something reckless. "I know," I whispered. His jaw tightened slightly. I saw the moment the restraint flickered behind his eyes. Then his hand slowly slid away from the wall. For a split second my heart jumped, thinking he might step aside. But he didn't. Instead, his fingers moved closer, hovering near my shoulder. Not touching. Just there. Waiting. The warmth from his hand spread through the air between us, and suddenly every nerve in my body felt awake. "You should hate me right now," I murmured. The words slipped out before I could stop them. His eyes softened slightly. "I don't hate you." The quiet certainty in his voice made my pulse stutter. "You should," I said again. Another beat of silence passed. Then he shook his head slowly. "No," he said. His hand finally moved. Just barely. His fingers brushed the fabric near my shoulder, not even fully touching my skin. just enough to make my breath hit sharply in my chest. The contact was so light it could have been accidental. But it wasn't. We both knew it. His voice dropped when he spoke again. You didn't tell me to move. I swallowed. You didn't move either. That faint half-smile returned to his mouth. Maybe I was waiting. For what? I asked. His eyes lowered briefly to my lips again before lifting back to mine. For you to stop pretending you wanted to leave. The honesty of it sent a wave of heat through my chest. And before I could stop myself, my hand slowly lifted. Not to push him away. Not to reach for the door. But to rest lightly against his chest. The moment my palm touched the warm fabric of his shirt, his breathing changed. And the entire world seemed to pause around us. For the first time that night, neither of us was pretending anymore. The moment my hand touched his chest, everything changed. Not dramatically, not loudly, just instantly. I felt the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath the thin fabric of his shirt. Slow, controlled, but stronger than before. My palm rested there almost cautiously, like I was testing whether the moment was real. He didn't pull away, but he didn't move closer either. He simply looked down at my hand, then back at me. The silence between us grew thicker, charged with something that had been building all night without either of us saying it out loud. You're touching me, he said quietly. It wasn't an accusation, more like an observation he was letting settle in the air. I know, I whispered. I should have moved my hand. Instead, my fingers slowly curled into the fabric of his shirt, barely gripping it. A tiny movement, but it made his breath deepen. His eyes darkened slightly as he watched me. Not surprised. Not shocked. Just focused like he was memorizing every second of this. You're still not leaving, he said. The reminder sent a small wave of guilt through my chest. My eyes flickered toward the door behind me again. Still closed. Still one step away. Then I looked back at him. No, I admitted. Another quiet second passed. The refrigerator hummed again in the kitchen. Somewhere outside, tires rolled slowly over the wet pavement of the street. Ordinary sounds continuing in a world that had nothing to do with what was happening here. His hand lifted slightly. For a moment it hovered near my arm. Not touching yet. Just waiting. You know what this means, he said softly. My stomach tightened. Yes. And you're still here. My fingers tightened slightly against his chest again before I could stop them. His gaze dropped to the movement. When his eyes lifted back to mine, the restraint there looked thinner than before. You could still stop this, he said. The words sounded sincere. That was the dangerous part. He wasn't pushing. He was giving me the choice. My voice came out almost breathless. You could step away. For the first time, a small, almost helpless smile touched his mouth. Now you want me to move? I shook my head slowly. No. The word left my lips before I had time to question it. And the moment it did, the space between us shifted again. His hand finally closed the small distance to my arm. Warm fingers resting lightly just below my shoulder. Not gripping. Just holding. The touch sent a quiet shiver through my body. I felt it immediately, the way my breath caught, the way my chest rose slightly closer to him without thinking. He noticed every bit of it. You're trembling again, he murmured. I told you I'm not. But the denial sounded softer now. Almost playful. His thumb moved slightly against my arm. Just a small motion through the fabric of my sleeve. And somehow that tiny movement sent warmth spreading down my spine. You should hate me, I said again quietly. He studied my face carefully. Then he shook his head. No, he said. His voice dropped lower. I think you already know I don't. My hand slowly slid higher on his chest, feeling the warmth beneath my palm. The steady rise and fall of his breathing. The solid presence of him standing so close. Dangerously close. My voice came out barely louder than a whisper. She'll be back soon. The words hung in the hallway like a warning. But neither of us moved. His eyes stayed locked on mine. Yes, he said. Another second passed. Then two. And instead of stepping away, he leaned just slightly closer. Not enough to touch. Just enough that I could feel his breath warm against my cheek. And suddenly the entire apartment felt far too small for the two of us. His breath brushed my cheek warm and slow. It was such a small thing, but it sent a quiet wave through my entire body. I could feel the space between us now, not empty anymore but fragile like a thin thread stretched too tight. One more movement from either of us and it would snap. "She'll be back soon," I repeated softly. My voice sounded different this time. Thinner. Less convincing. He didn't step away. Instead, his eyes searched mine carefully, like he was looking for the moment when I would finally pull back. But I didn't. His hand was still resting on my arm, warm and steady. My palm was still against his chest, feeling the rhythm beneath his shirt. Stronger now, less controlled. "You're reminding yourself," he said quietly. I frowned slightly. "What?" "That we shouldn't." The honesty in his voice made my stomach tighten. I swallowed. "Well, we shouldn't." But neither of us moved. The hallway light flickered faintly again, and for a second the shadows around us shifted. His face fell partly into the dimness, his eyes darker than before. Watching. Waiting. My fingers slowly loosened their grip on his shirt, but they didn't leave his chest. Instead, my hand flattened there, feeling the warmth of him fully now. And when I realized what I was doing, my breath caught. He noticed immediately. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "You're leaning into me." I froze. I hadn't even realized. But he was right. The door behind me was still touching my back. Yet my body had shifted forward just enough that the distance between us had almost disappeared. I forced out a small breath. "This is a mistake." "Probably," he said. But the words sounded distant, like it didn't have the power it should have had. Outside, a car door slammed somewhere down the street. The sound echoed faintly through the open window before fading away. Reality knocking softly at the edges of the moment. Still, we didn't move. His thumb shifted slightly against my arm again. A slow, absent movement that made my heart stumble. "Tell me to step away," he murmured. The same offer. The same escape. But now it felt heavier than before. 'Cause this time, if I said it, something fragile between us would break. My eyes dropped for a moment, watching the slow rise of his chest under my hand. Then they lifted back to his. "You're the one blocking the door," I whispered. His lips curved slightly again. "And you're the one who hasn't asked me to move." The quiet truth of it made my pulse race. Another second passed. Then another. And before I could stop myself, my hand slid slowly higher. From the center of his chest to the collar of his shirt. My fingers brushed the edge of the fabric there, barely touching the warm skin beneath. The reaction was instant. His breathing deepened. His eyes darkened. And the air between us suddenly felt electric. "You're making this impossible," he said quietly. But his voice didn't sound angry. It sounded like someone standing at the edge of something they knew they were about to fall into. I could feel the warmth of him everywhere now. His chest, his arm, the faint heat of his breath against my skin. My heart pounded harder. "I thought you wanted me to leave," I whispered. His gaze flickered to my lips again. Slowly. Carefully. "I did," he said. Then his voice dropped lower. "Until you stayed." The words lingered between us. My fingers were still resting against the open collar of his shirt, still feeling the warmth of his skin. And suddenly the silence felt too full. Too close. My voice came out softer than I expected. "Then why are you still standing there?" For a moment he didn't answer. He just looked at me. Really looked. Then his hand slowly slid from my arm down to my wrist. Gentle. Careful. Holding it there against his chest. And his voice dropped to a quiet confession. "Because if I step away now," he said, "I know you'll walk out that door. I know you'll walk out that door." His fingers stayed around my wrist, warm and steady against my skin. Not tight. Just enough to keep my hand resting where it was, against the quiet rise and fall of his chest. For a moment neither of us spoke. The hallway seemed impossibly still. Even the refrigerator in the kitchen had gone silent, leaving only the faint sound of our breathing filling the space between us. My heart was beating so hard it almost felt embarrassing. "You're assuming a lot," I said softly, but the words lacked strength. His thumb shifted slightly against my wrist, tracing the smallest arc across my skin. The motion was slow, absent-minded, but the effect it had on me was immediate. My breath caught again. His eyes noticed. Of course they did. "You're still here," he replied quietly. That simple truth hung in the air. I looked at the door behind him again. The brass handle reflected the dim hallway light, still within reach, still offering the same simple escape. One step, one word. That's all it would take. But instead my gaze drifted back to him. And this time I didn't hide it when my eyes lingered on his mouth. Something shifted in his expression when he saw that. Not surprise. Recognition. Like a moment he had been waiting for had finally arrived. "You should stop looking at me like that," he murmured. I tilted my head slightly. "Like what?" His jaw tightened faintly. "Like you're deciding something." The truth of it made my stomach twist. Because he wasn't wrong. Every second that passed was making the choice clearer. The world outside this apartment still existed. My friendship with his wife, the normal life waiting beyond this door. But inside this narrow hallway, everything felt suspended, fragile. His voice softened. "If you walk out now," he said, "this never happened." The offer sat between us like a final chance. My wrist was still in his hand. My other shoulder still pressed lightly against the door behind me. I looked at him carefully. "And if I don't?" I asked. His eyes darkened in a way that sent warmth rushing through my chest. For a moment he didn't answer. Instead, his free hand lifted slowly. Not rushed. Not sudden. Just deliberate. His fingers brushed a loose strand of hair away from my face, the touch so gentle it almost made my chest ache. My breath trembled. The contact lingered for a second longer than it should have. Then he finally spoke. "Then we stop pretending." The words were barely louder than the movement of the curtain in the other room. But they echoed through me. As deep down, I knew the pretending had ended the moment I dropped the keys. My voice came out soft. "Maybe we already did." His eyes searched mine one last time, slow, careful, almost asking again without saying the words. "Tell me to move. Tell me to stop." But I didn't. Instead, my hand slipped from the collar of his shirt to the back of his neck. The warmth of his skin beneath my fingers made his breath deepen instantly. The distance between us disappeared in a single quiet step. And when my forehead brushed lightly against his, neither of us stepped away. For a moment we simply stood there like that, breathing the same air, sharing the same silence. Then his voice dropped into the smallest whisper. "This changes everything." My fingers tightened slightly against the back of his neck. "I know." And this time, neither of us cared that the door was still right behind him. For a moment we didn't move. My forehead rested lightly against his, our breaths blending in the narrow space between us. I could feel the warmth of his skin, the quiet tension in the muscles beneath my fingers where they held the back of his neck. Everything felt suspended. The apartment, the night, even time itself seemed to hesitate. His hand was still around my wrist, but it loosened slowly, his fingers sliding down until they rested lightly against my palm. The touch was softer now, almost careful, like he understood how fragile this moment really was. My heart was still racing. "You're still shaking," he murmured. His voice brushed my lips when he spoke. I let out a quiet breath. "I think it's too late to pretend I'm not." For the first time that night he smiled. Not that restrained half-smile from before, but something warmer. Something honest. His hand moved slowly from my wrist to my waist, resting there gently. Not pulling. Just holding me close enough that I could feel the steady heat of him through the thin fabric of my dress. "You could still stop," he whispered. The words lingered between us, softer now. But they didn't feel like an exit anymore. They felt like the final truth we both already knew. My fingers brushed slowly through the hair at the back of his neck, feeling the subtle tension there. "I'm not the one who blocked the door," I said quietly. He looked at me for a long second. Then something in his expression shifted, the last piece of restraint dissolving quietly behind his eyes. "No," he admitted. "You're the one who stayed." The honesty of it made my chest tighten. Outside, headlights swept briefly across the living room window again, brightening the hallway for a single passing second. Reality brushing against the edges of the moment. But when the light faded, we were still standing there, still too close, still breathing the same quiet air. His hand slid slightly higher along my waist, and my body responded without thinking. leaning into him just enough to erase the final inch between us. The warmth of his chest met mine. My breath caught. His voice dropped into a whisper. If we cross this line. I knew the rest of the sentence without him finishing it. Nothing would ever feel quite the same again. Not dinners together. Not casual conversations. Not the simple comfort of friendship. The world we both knew would quietly shift. My fingers traced slowly along his collar again, feeling the warmth beneath the fabric. Then I lifted my eyes to his. I know, I said softly. Another second passed. Then another. And in that quiet space between hesitation and surrender, I didn't ask him to move. I didn't reach for the door. Instead, I closed the small distance between us and let the moment finally choose for both of us. Later that night, when I stepped back out into the cool air and heard the door close behind me, I realized something I hadn't understood before. Sometimes the most dangerous choices in life aren't the ones someone forces you into. They're the ones where the door was always open, and you simply decided not to walk through it.